Buy yourself breakfast. The first thing Nolan Pierce saw was the $50 bill sliding across the polished hangar floor and stopping beside his oil-stained boot. Above him, Meredith Caldwell, the billionaire CEO of Caldwell Aeronautics, stood in her tailored white blazer, smiling like she had just dismissed a beggar. Behind her, 12 elite engineers surrounded the dead Argent Falcon 9000, a private jet worth more than Nolan's entire life could ever repay, and every one of them had failed to make it breathe. "Buy yourself breakfast," Meredith said loud enough for the whole hangar to hear. "Unless you really believe you can fix what my best people can't." Nolan glanced at the frozen cockpit lights, then at Russell Dane, the maintenance director, whose face tightened the moment Nolan reached for his tool bag. "Give me 5 minutes," Nolan said. Meredith laughed and raised the stakes to $5 million in front of everyone there. Cameras came out. Workers stopped moving. Nolan opened one access panel, touched one reversed pin, and nodded to the pilot. The engines roared alive, but Nolan wasn't watching Meredith's shock. He was watching Russell turn pale, as if the jet had revealed a secret it was never supposed to reveal. Nolan Pierce had learned long ago that machines were more honest than people. A machine might scream stall, overheat spit oil across a floor, or refuse to move no matter how much money stood around it in tailored suits, but it never lied about what was wrong. It always left a sound, a smell, a vibration, a rhythm that was slightly off, and if a man was patient enough to listen, the truth would eventually crawl out from between the bolts. People were different. People smiled while hiding fear. People shook hands while planning betrayal. People looked at a man's worn boots and oil-stained sleeves and decided in 3 seconds what he was worth. That Wednesday morning in Wichita began with a sound Nolan knew too well, the starter on his old service truck grinding like it was considering retirement. He turned the key once, waited, turned it again, and on the third attempt the engine coughed awake beneath the hood. He sat behind the wheel for a moment outside the small blue-gray building that housed Pierce Airworks, watching the sunrise burn pale orange across the edge of High Plains Aviation Center. His shop was not impressive from the outside. 2 service bays, 1 cramped office, a cracked parking lot, a hand-painted sign, and a chain-link fence that rattled whenever the Kansas wind came hard out of the west. But inside that building were 4 technicians he trusted, a wall of certifications he had earned, 1 test, and 1 scarred knuckle at a time, and the only life he had been able to build after leaving the Air Force, with a folder of commendations and a daughter who needed him home more than any commanding officer ever had. Sophie was 16 now, old enough to pretend she did not worry about money and smart enough to know exactly when he was hiding bills under repair manuals. That morning before school, she had stood in the shop doorway with her backpack on one shoulder and asked whether the insurance notice on his desk was one of the bad ones. Nolan had told her it was just paperwork. She had looked at him for 2 full seconds the way she looked at a faulty gauge and said, "Dad, paperwork doesn't make you skip coffee." Then she had kissed his cheek, stolen half his breakfast sandwich, and left before he could think of a lie better than silence. The truth was that Pierce Airworks was owed $64,000 by a charter company that kept promising payment by Friday and never naming which Friday. Payroll was due in 9 days. The hangar lease was due in 12. Their liability carrier had raised premiums again, and one more missed payment would put the shop in the kind of administrative trouble that did not care how good a mechanic was. That was why Nolan loaded the reconditioned auxiliary valves himself and drove across the service road to Caldwell Aeronautics' main hangar instead of sending one of his crew. The delivery mattered, but the conversation he hoped to catch mattered more. Caldwell sometimes sent overflow maintenance to smaller certified shops, and one steady contract from them could give Pierce Airworks the breathing room it needed. He knew it was a long shot. Companies like Caldwell did not usually look toward the edge of the airport unless something had already gone wrong. By the time Nolan reached the restricted gate, something had clearly gone wrong. Security trucks sat angled near the main hangar. A fuel crew waited beside a tanker with their arms crossed. Men and women in pressed uniforms moved too quickly through the wide doors. Through the opening, Nolan saw the Argent Falcon 9000 sitting under the lights like a silver animal that had refused to wake. Everyone in regional aviation knew that aircraft. It belonged to Meredith Caldwell, CEO of Caldwell Aeronautics. And depending on who was talking, it was either the most advanced private jet in Kansas or the most expensive monument to executive impatience ever parked on concrete. Nolan signed the vendor sheet, clipped the temporary badge to his shirt, and carried the valve crate through the side entrance. The first failed start sequence reached him before he reached the receiving counter. It was not loud, not dramatic, not the kind of failure that made people duck or run. It was worse than that. It was almost normal. The cockpit lights cycled, the auxiliary systems came alive. The left engine began its spool, and then the whole sequence hesitated for half a breath before falling back into silence. Around the aircraft, at least 12 specialists were already working. 2 were connected to the avionics bay with laptops. 3 had panels open near the left nacelle. Another pair argued quietly beside a diagnostic cart. Near the boarding stairs stood Meredith Caldwell herself, tall, composed, and visibly furious in a white blazer that looked untouched by the chaos around her. Nolan recognized her from industry interviews and trade magazine covers. In those photographs, she looked confident in the way people did when no one in the room could afford to interrupt them. In person, there was a harder edge to her stillness, a restraint that seemed less like calm than pressure trapped behind glass. Nolan set the crate on the receiving counter and listened. That was all. He did not step forward. He did not raise a hand. He only stood still and let the next attempted start pass through the hangar. The same hesitation came again. A tiny delay in the auxiliary intake response. The computer was waiting for a condition that had already been met, or thought a condition had not been met, because something mechanical was telling it the wrong story. Nolan had heard that kind of lie from machines before. It was the sound of a system protecting itself from a danger that did not exist. "Receiving is around back," a voice said sharply. Nolan turned and found Russell Dane blocking the aisle. Russell was Caldwell's maintenance director, a broad-shouldered man with silver at his temples, a clean company jacket, and the kind of posture that made every conversation feel like a locked door. Nolan had seen him at airport meetings but never spoken to him for more than a few seconds. Russell looked at the crate, then at Nolan's shirt, then at the vendor badge, like all 3 offended him. Deliveries do not stand around inside an active diagnostic zone. Nolan kept his tone even. Your start sequence is hanging at the intake interlock handoff. Russell's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes tightened. Excuse me? There's a lag in the auxiliary intake valve response. Not enough for the software team to chase unless they're listening for it. The computer thinks one of the maintenance conditions is still open. A technician nearby glanced up from his laptop. Russell stepped closer. This aircraft has been under review for 3 hours by factory-certified specialists. I can see that. Then you can also see this is not a place for a side shop mechanic to audition. Nolan had heard worse. He had heard it in hangars on bases from contractors, from men who confused clean fingernails with competence. He looked past Russell toward the forward maintenance panel. If you check the external interlock stack by hand, I think you'll find 1 flag out of position. Russell's jaw flexed. Leave the crate and return to your facility. Meredith's voice cut in before Nolan could answer. What is he talking about? The hangar seemed to narrow around her as she walked over. Up close, Meredith Caldwell looked younger than her reputation and colder than her photographs. Her eyes moved quickly over Nolan's faded workshirt oil stain on the cuff boots that had seen too many hangar floors, hands marked by years of doing the work other people signed off on. She did not ask his name. He is delivering refurbished valves, Russell said, and offering unsolicited theories. Is that right? Meredith asked. Nolan met her eyes. Your jet isn't refusing to start because it's broken. It's refusing because it thinks it's still being serviced. Give me 5 minutes at the forward panel and I can tell you whether I'm wrong. Someone near the avionics cart gave a quiet laugh. Meredith turned her head slightly toward the aircraft, then back to Nolan. Her schedule was written all over the hangar. The waiting flight crew, the legal assistant whispering into a phone, the fuel truck standing by the tension of people who knew a missed departure could cost more than money. The Peregrine Battery Systems meeting in Denver had been discussed in every aviation business column that week. Caldwell Aeronautics needed that acquisition, and Meredith needed to be in that room. Instead, her $70 million jet sat dead, while a man from a two-bay repair shop told her the answer might be behind one panel. Her patience snapped in a way so controlled it almost looked elegant. She reached into her blazer, pulled out a folded $50 bill, and placed it on top of Nolan's crate. "Buy yourself breakfast," she said loud enough for the nearby crew to hear. "Then clear my hangar." The insult landed in the open space between them. Nolan looked at the bill. He thought of Sophie asking about the notice on his desk. He thought of his crew pretending not to worry when he delayed replacing the compressor in Bay 2. He thought of how easily people with money turned humiliation into a gesture small enough to deny later. Then he set his tool bag down beside the crate and left the bill exactly where it was. 5 minutes, he said. Russell moved as if to block him. Absolutely not. But Meredith lifted one hand and the gesture stopped everyone. A dangerous amusement had entered her face. She had decided, Nolan realized, to let the poor mechanic embarrass himself because it would cost her less than arguing. "You think you can fix what 12 certified specialists have not fixed?" she asked. "I think I can identify the fault." "No," she said. "Let's make it clearer. If you make that jet start, I will pay you $5 million. The hangar went quiet enough for Nolan to hear the soft hum of the overhead lights. Phones came out. One technician actually stepped back to get a better view. Nolan did not smile. "Say it again." Meredith's eyes narrowed. "What if you want witnesses, make sure they know what they're witnessing." Pride did the rest. Meredith turned slightly, projecting her voice across the polished floor. "If Nolan, from whatever shop he came from, can start my aircraft in 5 minutes, Caldwell Aeronautics will pay him $5 million. "Pierce Airworks," Nolan said. Then he picked up his tool bag and walked toward the Argent Falcon 9000. No one spoke as he opened the forward maintenance access panel. He did not hurry because hurry made hands stupid. He checked the first interlock, then the second, then the third. There it was. The number 2 intake isolation pin seated backward, not loose, not worn, not accidentally misaligned, but reversed with the kind of force that meant someone had made it fit wrong on purpose. Nolan felt the first cold thread of unease move through his chest. A mistake had a shape. This had intent. He rotated the pin, checked the adjacent sensor-tested continuity with his handheld meter, and closed nothing yet. "Run the sequence," he called. The pilot, Travis Holt, looked toward Meredith. She gave a stiff nod. The cockpit came alive. The left engine spooled past the point where it had died before and caught with a deep, rising growl. 3 seconds later, the right engine answered. The sound filled the hangar, rolled across the concrete, and swallowed every whisper. Meredith's face changed before she could stop it. Disbelief, then calculation, then a flash of respect. She did not seem ready to own. Someone swore softly. Someone else laughed once in shock. But Nolan was no longer looking at Meredith. At the far end of the hangar, Russell Dane had gone completely still. His face had lost color, not like a man surprised by a repair, but like a man who had just watched a buried thing claw its way back into daylight. Nolan stepped away from the panel and listened to the engines settle. Beneath the clean roar was another rhythm, faint but wrong, a pulse in the left fuel feed that rose and dipped every few seconds like a warning whispered under applause. Meredith was already speaking to an assistant about payment authorization when Nolan raised his hand toward the cockpit. "Shut it down," Russell's voice cracked across the hangar. "Do not touch anything else." Meredith turned on Nolan, the embarrassment in her face hardening into anger. "You proved your point. Step away from my aircraft. Nolan waited until Travis began the shutdown cycle. Only then did he speak. That first fault kept your jet from starting. The second one wouldn't show itself until after you were in the air. The silence that followed was different from the first. This one had fear in it. Lydia Banks Caldwell's safety certification engineer moved to the nearest monitor and began pulling the data Nolan requested. The pressure pattern was there, small enough to ignore, regular enough to matter. Then she found the gap, 3 missing seconds in a continuous system log. Nolan saw Meredith understand the size of the room had changed. This was no longer about an insult or a bet or a mechanic proving rich people wrong. Russell stepped forward before anyone else could speak, and his voice came out steady, prepared. He reminded Meredith that Pierce Airworks had supplied components installed on the Falcon 3 days earlier. He suggested Nolan had created the fault, returned to discover it, and staged a public miracle for $5 million. The accusation landed cleanly because it had been built to land cleanly. Heads turned toward Nolan. Meredith stared at him as if trying to decide whether his calm was innocence or performance. Nolan could have argued. He could have shouted, threatened, demanded the money, demanded respect. Instead, he placed his meter on the cart and held out his hands for security. "Seal the aircraft," he said to Lydia, "not Meredith. And don't let anyone rewrite that log." By sunset, Nolan Pierce would be sitting alone in a crew lounge under suspicion of sabotaging a CEO's jet, while the only thing standing between Meredith Caldwell and a possible disaster was the word of the man she had tried to dismiss with $50. The crew lounge at Caldwell Aeronautics was too clean to feel comfortable. Nolan Pierce sat alone at a rectangular table beneath a humming light. His hands folded in front of him, his phone tool bag and meter taken by security, as if a man could sabotage a $70 million aircraft with a guilty expression and empty pockets. Through the thick glass wall, he could see the far edge of the hangar, the nose of the Argent Falcon 9000, and the blurred movement of people pretending they were not frightened. No one had officially accused him of a crime, but the way the security guard stood outside the door said, enough. Nolan had been in rooms like this before, not always with walls, not always with chairs, but always with the same invisible weight. A machine had told the truth. A person did not want to hear it, and now the man who listened too closely had become the problem. He thought of Sophie at school, probably checking her phone between classes, probably seeing nothing yet, and he hoped the story would not reach her before he had something better than silence to give her. Outside, Lydia Banks moved through the investigation with a steadiness Nolan had noticed the moment she touched the data console. She was not trying to protect anyone's ego. She was trying to protect the aircraft. That made her dangerous in the best possible way. She started where Russell Dane had aimed his accusation, the auxiliary components delivered by Pierce Airworks. One by one, she verified serial numbers, inspection stamps, manufacturing tolerances, installation records, and certification tags. The valves were clean. Not just acceptable, not just defensible, but exactly what Nolan's paperwork said they were. More importantly, they belonged to a system nowhere near the intake isolation pin Nolan had found reversed. The fault had lived in a restricted forward maintenance zone that required a Caldwell internal credential, not a vendor delivery badge. Lydia printed the result, circled the access classification, and carried it to Meredith Caldwell, who had taken over a glass-walled conference room beside the hangar, as if a room with a larger table could give her back control. Meredith read the summary once, then again more slowly. "So he couldn't have reached it?" she asked. Lydia did not soften the answer. Not through the delivery route, not during normal vendor access, not without someone inside opening the way or forging the record. Russell, standing near the window with his arms crossed, answered before Meredith could. "Then check the access logs." He said it too quickly, and Lydia noticed, though Meredith did not. The digital log appeared to support him. Nolan's vendor credential had been used at 3:22 in the morning 2 days earlier to enter the forward maintenance bay. Russell leaned into the silence that followed. "There it is." Meredith stared at the screen, and something in her face hardened because uncertainty was easier to bear than betrayal from a man she had just humiliated. "Pull secondary verification," she said. Russell shifted his weight. "That may take time." "Take it," Meredith snapped. Lydia pulled it herself. The first camera angle from the employee corridor showed a figure in a cap passing through the maintenance door, face turned away, badge scan matching Nolan's credential. It looked bad. It looked designed to look bad. Lydia requested external feeds from Pierce Airworks for the same timestamp, expecting nothing and getting everything. There, beneath the grainy black and white glow of Nolan's own security camera, was Nolan's truck in front of his shop at 3:22 a.m. Bay. Doors open, Nolan clearly visible under the wing of an emergency medical transport plane, working beside two paramedics and his senior technician, Eli Mercer. The timestamp matched. The face matched. The location made the access log impossible. Someone had copied Nolan's code and used it to build a paper trail. Meredith watched the footage without speaking. For the first time that day, the $50 bill seemed to return to the room not as an object, but as a verdict. She had not merely insulted a man. She had nearly helped frame him. Still, she did not go to the crew lounge herself. Pride had not left her. It had only gone quiet. She sent Lydia with the printouts and a payment document drafted by legal, a document that called Nolan's action an emergency restoration of aircraft operability and promised the $5 million if he signed a post-service confirmation stating the Argent Falcon 9000 had been returned to airworthy condition. Nolan read every line. Lydia watched him as if she were watching an instrument settle. "They cleared the access issue," she said. "This gets you paid." Nolan placed the paper flat on the table. "No." "No." The jet started. "That doesn't make it airworthy." Lydia's expression changed, not into surprise, but recognition. "You're refusing $5 million. I'm refusing to sign a lie, even if it saves your shop." Nolan looked up then, and the question found the bruise beneath his calm. Especially then. Lydia sat across from him. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then she opened her folder and showed him 3 anomaly reports she had filed over the last 4 months, each documenting a left feed pressure variance under load, each closed by Russell Dane with the same note: likely sensor drift, no further action required. Nolan read the reports carefully, tapping one finger beside the pressure intervals. "This rhythm," he said. "It was there before today." "Yes." And Russell buried it. Lydia did not answer because saying it aloud would move suspicion from theory into accusation. Nolan leaned back. The reversed pin was noise, loud enough to stop the departure, simple enough to blame on whoever they wanted. But that pressure issue underneath it, if your alerting protocol is compromised, the crew might not see the problem until they're already chasing symptoms. Lydia's face went pale in a way no camera could capture. "You think the warning system was touched? I think somebody wanted that aircraft in the air after everyone stopped looking at why it shouldn't be." While Lydia and Nolan rebuilt the problem from the inside out, Meredith received a call from her father, Howard Caldwell. Howard had founded Caldwell Aeronautics before Meredith was born, back when the company owned more debt than equipment, and the main office was a trailer that leaked every time it rained. He was 78 now, officially retired, and unofficially impossible to keep out of a crisis. His voice came through Meredith's private line, flat and unsentimental. "Ground the aircraft, seal every system, and bring in an independent investigator." Meredith stood with her back to the conference room, watching the Falcon sit useless under the lights. "I need to be in Denver." "No," Howard said. "You need to still have a company tomorrow. The Peregrine deadline may not be the real deadline. Ask yourself who benefits if you miss it." Meredith closed her eyes. She already knew the name he wanted her to say, and she hated him for making her think it. Conrad Mace Caldwell's chief operating officer had opposed the Peregrine battery systems acquisition from the beginning. He had called it reckless expensive, a distraction from core operations. He had pushed instead for a sale of Caldwell's regional service division to Apex Dominion Group, a private aerospace conglomerate that promised immediate liquidity and long-term dependence dressed up as partnership. Meredith had blocked him twice. Conrad had accepted defeat with the polished grace of a man saving anger for a better room. "You think Conrad is involved?" she asked. Howard did not hesitate. "I think ambition gets creative when it loses in public." Meredith wanted to dismiss him. She wanted to believe this was paranoia from an old founder who saw enemies in every boardroom. But the missing data gap was real. Nolan's cloned badge was real. His refusal to sign away the truth for $5 million was real. So Meredith did what she did not emotionally want to do. She grounded the aircraft officially, sealed the hangar systems, authorized Lydia to work with Nolan under restricted oversight, and called an independent certification firm. Within 2 hours, Nolan and Lydia found the second layer. It was not in the hardware. It was buried inside a routine flight management update pushed 4 days earlier, a small embedded subroutine attached to the fuel pressure alerting protocol. In normal operation, a left feed variance above a defined threshold would trigger a cockpit warning fast enough for the crew to reduce load crossfeed and isolate the problem. The modified protocol delayed that threshold during cruise phase by forcing the system to classify the variance as acceptable drift until the pressure swing tripled. "This is not maintenance," Lydia whispered. "No," Nolan said. "This is someone gambling with altitude." The update had been authorized through an executive-level account. Before they could trace more, Conrad Mace arrived. He entered the hangar in a Navy suit, calm, concerned, and perfectly timed. Meredith met him near the wing. Conrad asked about the aircraft, about Denver, about the risk of allowing an outside contractor at the center of a sensitive investigation. His words were reasonable. That was what made them sharp. "With respect," he said, looking toward Nolan, "a man tied to a disputed $5 million claim should not be directing Caldwell's safety review." Nolan crouched beside the aft electronics bay, stood slowly. "You came straight to the left avionics access port." Conrad turned. "What? Nobody briefed you on where we were working." A small pause opened. Not long. Not enough for a confession. Enough for Lydia to look up. Conrad smiled. "It's my job to understand my own aircraft." "It's Meredith's aircraft," Nolan said. "And you didn't ask what was wrong. You walked to where it was hidden." Lydia pulled security footage from the previous night. Russell entered the Falcon at 11:48 p.m., moved through the cabin, and spent 13 minutes in the forward avionics bay. At the edge of another frame near the hangar's secondary entrance stood a second figure too far from the camera to identify, but present during the window when the software update was uploaded. Russell had physical access. Someone else had executive credentials. Conrad's smile remained, but it no longer reached his eyes. The story should have stayed inside the investigation. It did not. By the next morning, aviation trade sites were already reporting that a small shop mechanic had interfered with Caldwell Aeronautics' return-to-service process after demanding $5 million from the CEO. The language was too precise, too coordinated, too eager to make Nolan the villain. 2 Pierce Airworks clients suspended their accounts pending clarification. The insurance carrier placed the shop's active certifications under review. Sophie called Nolan from school, her voice too controlled, asking why people online were saying he tried to scam a CEO. That hurt more than the accusation itself. He told her the truth was moving slower than the lie, but it was still moving. An hour later, a courier in an expensive coat delivered a settlement letter to Pierce Airworks, offering Nolan $500,000 in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement withdrawal from the investigation and release of any claim related to Meredith's public bet. Nolan read the letter twice, then locked it in his desk. It was not a temptation. It was evidence. Meredith, meanwhile, faced her own pressure. Her communications team wanted a neutral statement. Conrad's allies on the board wanted a governance review. Howard told her she had 2 choices: Let the lie define Nolan, or tell everyone exactly what she had done, including the part where she threw $50 at his feet. Before she could decide, Lydia found the backup file. The original software snapshot proved the alerting thresholds had been altered through Conrad's executive session at 4:41 a.m. Russell was located that afternoon at a roadside motel outside Salina, and admitted Conrad had offered to pay off his debts if he created a simple mechanical delay that would make Meredith miss Denver. Russell swore he had not touched the software. That made the truth worse, not better. The reversed pin was only the first door. Conrad had opened it, and someone with a larger interest in killing the Peregrine deal had walked through. 48 hours later, the board called an emergency session. Conrad's attorneys arrived ready. They argued that Meredith's $5 million bet proved reckless judgment, unauthorized financial commitment, and dangerous reliance on an unvetted mechanic during a security incident. It was not a weak argument. Cameras had recorded the bet. Witnesses had heard it. Nolan's presence could be made to look like chaos, and Meredith's pride could be made to look like incompetence. As the board members turned from the evidence to the optics, Nolan understood the trap had widened. If they accepted Conrad's version, Meredith would fall. Pierce Airworks would be ruined, the software trail would be buried under legal process, and the man who had almost sent a compromised jet into the sky would walk away behind the word governance. For the first time since the engines roared, Nolan felt the floor drop beneath him. The machine had told the truth, but now people would decide whether truth was convenient enough to matter. Howard Caldwell did not speak when the emergency board session began, and that silence frightened Meredith more than any accusation Conrad Mace's attorneys could have made. Her father sat at the far end of the polished table with both hands folded over the head of his cane, looking less like the retired founder of Caldwell Aeronautics than the man who had built the company in the first place by knowing exactly when to let fools finish talking. Conrad's legal team had taken the room early. They spread folders, timelines, and printed stills from the hangar cameras across the table with the confidence of people who understood that truth was not always the thing that won first. Their argument was elegant because it avoided the parts of the story that could not be explained away. They did not begin with the reversed pin, the cloned access badge, the missing seconds in the system log, or the corrupted fuel pressure protocol. They began with Meredith. They played the clip of her dropping the $50 bill at Nolan Pierce's feet. They played the clip of her promising $5 million in front of employees, contractors, flight crew, and security cameras. They froze the image on Nolan walking toward the aircraft with his tool bag, while Caldwell's own specialists stood aside. This Conrad's lead attorney said touching the screen with one finger is not leadership under pressure. This is a chief executive losing control of an aviation security event, making an unauthorized financial commitment, and granting operational influence to a financially distressed outside mechanic who had already been connected to components on that aircraft. Meredith felt every board member turn toward her without turning their heads. She knew the argument was poisonous, but it was not empty. She had been arrogant. She had been careless. She had looked at Nolan's boots, his shirt, his delivery crate, and she had measured him with the worst part of herself. If this room wanted to turn that moment into evidence that she should no longer lead Caldwell Aeronautics, she had given them the blade. Conrad sat opposite her in a charcoal suit, calm enough to seem injured by the whole situation. He did not look like a man accused of sabotage. He looked like a man saddened by another person's poor judgment. That was always his gift. He knew how to make ambition appear responsible. No one disputes. His attorney continued that Mr. Pierce identified a mechanical irregularity. But the question before this board is whether Ms. Caldwell's subsequent reliance on him and her public promise of $5 million compromised the company's governance and exposed Caldwell Aeronautics to legal, regulatory, and reputational risk. Nolan stood along the side wall beside Lydia Banks, not seated because no one had offered him a chair, and he had not asked for one. He wore the same work shirt from the hangar, cleaned as best as possible, but still marked faintly at the cuff, and he listened without expression. Meredith wondered if he hated her. She would have understood if he did. His shop had been dragged into public suspicion. His daughter had heard classmates call him a scammer. His insurance carrier had placed his certifications under review. He had been offered enough money to save everything and still had refused to sign a sentence he knew was false. Now Conrad's lawyers were using Meredith's insult to bury both of them. When the attorney finished, Howard finally moved. He did not stand quickly. Age made that impossible. But when he rose, the room changed. He placed a thin folder on the table and slid it toward the center. "Before anyone votes on my daughter's judgment," he said, "you should understand the judgment of the man asking you to remove her." Conrad's expression did not alter, but Meredith saw his hand close once around his pen. Howard opened the folder himself. Inside were records from 2 private meetings between Conrad and Apex Dominion Group, the conglomerate that had been trying for months to acquire Caldwell's regional service division. There were emails routed through personal accounts, a draft advisory agreement, and a compensation structure contingent on the failure of the Peregrine Battery Systems acquisition. If Meredith missed the Denver meeting, if the Peregrine board lost confidence, if Caldwell's future technology strategy collapsed under uncertainty, Conrad would be positioned to revive the Apex sale and personally profit from it. Howard did not dramatize the evidence. He simply laid each page down and let the room read. Strategic disagreement is one thing, he said. Selling the company's future out from under its own shareholders is another. Conrad's attorney began to object, but one of the board members cut him off. Meredith looked at Conrad, then really looked at him, and the 6 years of carefully reasoned opposition-patient warnings, private doubts, and polished loyalty rearranged themselves into something uglier. He had not been cautious. He had been waiting. Meredith stood before anyone asked her to respond. For the first time all day, she did not try to sound composed. "What I did in that hangar was wrong," she said. "I dropped $50 at Nolan Pierce's feet because I believed I knew what kind of man he was before I had heard him. I made a $5 million promise in anger and pride. I will not rename that as strategy. If this board refuses to classify the payment as an emergency service award, I will pay it personally." She placed a signed personal check on the table. "But before you decide my worst 5 minutes matter more than what happened afterward, ask yourselves what would be in the air right now if Mr. Pierce had taken the money, signed the first document our legal department handed him, and walked away." She turned toward Nolan. "He refused $5 million because the aircraft was not safe. I did not have the judgment to see that before he did." The room went still, not forgiving, not yet, but listening. Lydia stepped forward and connected her laptop to the display. "Mr. Pierce requested one exhibit," she said. "The simulation was generated by my team using the recovered pre-modification software, the altered protocol, and the pressure variance recorded from the left feed system." Nolan moved beside her. He did not look at Conrad. He did not look at Meredith. He looked at the board as if they were a diagnostic panel, and the only useful thing was clarity. "The reversed intake pin stopped the aircraft from starting," he said. "That fault was simple, visible, and loud. It created delay. The software modification was quiet. It changed how the aircraft interpreted a fuel pressure variance during cruise phase." Lydia started the simulation. On the left side of the screen, the restored system flagged the variance in under 4 seconds, routing the warning to both primary and backup crew displays. On the right side, the modified system continued to classify the same variance as acceptable drift. 5 seconds passed. 10. 15. At 22 seconds, the warning finally appeared. Nolan let the number sit in the room. "At 38,000 feet, 22 seconds is not paperwork," he said. "It is the difference between a crew managing a problem and a crew discovering they are already behind it." No one spoke. Even Conrad's attorney had stopped arranging his papers. Nolan continued, his voice quiet enough that people had to lean toward it. "You can argue about the bet. You can argue about whether I should have been allowed near the aircraft. You can argue about who looked foolish in the hangar. But machines do not care about embarrassment. They do not care about titles. This aircraft was telling you something was wrong. The only question is whether this company is built to listen before or after people get hurt." That ended the room more completely than anger could have. The vote that followed was unanimous. Independent oversight would continue. Conrad Mace was suspended pending formal investigation. All records related to the Argent Falcon 9000, the cloned badge Russell Danes access, and the software modification would be transferred to the Aviation Authority and state investigators. Conrad left through the side door without looking back. His attorney called the decision premature. Howard called it late. Russell Danes' cooperation agreement came within 24 hours. He admitted Conrad had approached him 6 weeks earlier with an offer to settle his personal debt if he created a mechanical delay that would make Meredith miss the Peregrine meeting. Russell insisted he had only reversed the intake pin and had known nothing about the software. The investigators believed part of that, which made the whole thing worse. Conrad had opened the door with Russell's help, but someone connected to Apex's outside technical consultants had used that door to bury a deeper alteration in the flight management system. What began as a plan to delay a CEO had become a risk to everyone who would have been aboard. Caldwell Aeronautics released the preliminary findings simultaneously to the board, the Aviation Authority, and 3 aviation trade reporters, despite Meredith's communications team begging for a staged rollout. Nolan had said staged transparency was just another kind of control. Howard had agreed. Meredith had taken 10 seconds to hate the idea and then approved it. The public story turned slowly, as public stories do when lies get a head start, but it turned. The headlines changed from "Mechanic demands $5 million" to "Outside mechanic prevented potential flight safety incident." 2 clients called Pierce Airworks to reinstate their accounts. The insurance carrier withdrew its review. Sophie sent Nolan a message during lunch that said only, "Everyone is suddenly acting like they believed you the whole time." I didn't. He kept that message longer than any article. 3 days after the board vote, Meredith drove alone to Pierce Airworks. No assistant, no security detail, no company car. She parked beside Nolan's battered service truck and stood at the open bay until he rolled out from under the nose gear of a small Citation, wiping his hands on a rag. For a moment, neither of them had the advantage. She was not in her hangar. He was not in her conference room. The board authorized the $5 million as an emergency service award, she said, holding out a folder. The language protects your right to testify, your right to communicate with investigators, and makes no statement that the Falcon is airworthy. Nolan took the folder, read it on the hood of the Citation, and asked 3 questions precise enough to make Meredith understand he had not survived this long by trusting generous language. When she answered all 3, he signed. "I'll use what the shop needs," he said. "Lease balance, payroll, insurance equipment. The rest stays separate until the investigation closes. It's your money." "I know." She winced at the clean edge of it, then looked toward the service bay where his crew worked with their heads down, pretending not to listen. "I called Sophie," she said. Nolan stopped folding the document. Meredith added quickly, "Only to tell her what her father did. She told me you didn't need anyone to explain that your work mattered, but that it might be good for you to hear it from someone outside the family." Nolan looked away first. That was the closest he came to forgiveness that day. 10 days later, the Argent Falcon 9000 underwent a full ground systems test under independent supervision. Nolan and Lydia coordinated the sequence while federal observers watched from behind a marked line. The restored software caught the simulated pressure variance in under 4 seconds. The modified software, preserved in a sealed test environment, waited 18 to 22 seconds depending on load conditions. The report was undeniable. Conrad was referred for investigation of securities fraud material, misrepresentation, and conspiracy related to unauthorized aircraft system access. Apex denied knowledge. Their denial was professionally written and believed by no one who had read the logs. The Peregrine deal survived. The deadline Meredith had believed immovable had been inflated by Conrad to create pressure that did not exist. When Peregrine's board saw the transparency of Caldwell's response, they did not walk away. They extended due diligence. Howard later offered Nolan the position of Director of Safety at Caldwell Aeronautics with a compensation package that would have made Pierce Airworks unnecessary within a year. Nolan listened respectfully and declined. "You don't need a safety director who reports to the CEO," he said. "You need a place your own people can go when the chain of command becomes the problem." He proposed something stranger and stronger. Pierce Independent Aviation Center, funded by Caldwell, but governed by a charter that prevented Caldwell executives from altering technical findings, suppressing anomaly reports, or retaliating against employees who raised safety concerns. It would audit maintenance records, certify technicians, train inspectors, and preserve independent reporting channels. Meredith brought the proposal to the board herself. "This is not a limitation on our authority," she said. "It is proof that our authority can be trusted." The center opened in the old North Cargo facility 6 months later. Meredith had the $50 bill framed and mounted in the main training room without a plaque. Everyone knew enough by then. Pierce Airworks kept its original shop, its original sign, and its original crew because Nolan believed not everything had to become larger to become better. The Falcon returned to service on a clear autumn morning when the Kansas sky looked freshly washed. Meredith offered Nolan a seat on the first flight. He declined. He had work. Instead, he stood with Sophie and his crew behind the runway fence as the Argent Falcon 9000 taxied into position. The engines climbed cleanly. No hesitation, no hidden pulse, no warning buried under pride. As the jet lifted, Meredith looked down from the cabin window and saw Nolan turn away before it vanished into the clouds. He was talking to his daughter, one hand resting on the fence, already finished with the moment everyone else wanted to make symbolic. There had been a morning when Meredith Caldwell decided a man was worth $50 because she had looked for 3 seconds and seen only oil debt and inconvenience. 5 minutes later, that same man had made her jet roar, but the sound that saved her company was not the engine. It was the silence after when Nolan Pierce refused to be bought, refused to be rushed, and listened long enough to hear the truth still hiding underneath.